Okay, today's daf B'ezras Hashem is daf Kuf Yud Beis in Chulin. However, we're going to be starting from pretty much the bottom of Kuf Yud Aleph from Beis, the first wide line, Itmar, Dogam Sha'olu Bekara. That's where we're going to start from. We didn't finish this yesterday, we started it, but let's go it over again. So Itmar, we learned, Dogam Sha'olu Bekara, a fish that was placed into a meat plate when it was hot. So Rab says, Asla Achla Mekutach, it's also to eat the fish with kutach. Shmuel Amar mutar la'achal mekutach. Shmuel says it's mutar to eat the fish with kutach. Rav Amar also naisin tamu. Shmuel Amar mutar naisin tam by naisin tamu. Rav says it's also to eat the fish with kutach because the meat taste had been imparted to the fish, and Shmuel says it's mutar to eat the fish with kutach because it's only an imparted taste of an imparted taste. Had the fish been cooked together with the meat itself, it would taka be aser to be eaten with meat. Likewise, if hot milk itself had been placed in the meat, on the plate, the milk would be aser. For the taste, it gives directly a flavor from the meat into the fish or into the pot. That's going to be treated as meat itself, which is also with milk. In our case, the fish did not get a taste directly from the meat, but rather from the ka'ara, which is the plate, which contains only an imparted flavor of meat, not the meat itself. So this is where we start the sugya of what's called nat bar nat, nice and tam. Bar naisin tam, it's not actual meat, but it's only a flavor. And this ruling of Rab answering fish with kutach was not said explicitly by him, but it was derived from an inference from an incident involving him. The Rab iklal be'er of Simi bar Chia Barbarei. Rab once visited the home of Rav Simi bar Chia, his grandson. While Rab was there, his eyes started hurting him. Avdulay shaifa b'tzah. They prepared for him an ointment on a plate. Probably made out of herbs or all kinds of other good stuff that they used to use in those days. Sometime later, they put some cooked food onto the same plate. And Rav tasted the taste of the ointment in the food. He says it gives mamash a strong taste, a strong flavor. The ointment gave such a strong flavor into the plate that the taste was discernible in the food. I mean, it's almost like when you wash a cup and you don't rinse it out with all the soap when you're done with it, so you still have a big flavor of the soap in the water or seltzer or soda that you're drinking. So those hearing this comment, and further, Rav would hold that a naisin tam bar naisin tam should be significant in all other cases as well, and he would answer hot fish which was placed in a meat plate to be eaten together with kutach, which is milchik. But the Gemara rejects this and says, "V'lahi, it's not so. Shani hasam the nafish mirarat fei." It was different in the case of when Rav had an eye ache because the ointment was extremely bitter. The herbs that were used in making the ointment were extremely potent, and therefore the flavor remained strong even after having been twice transmitted. Rabbi Lazar was once standing before the Rebbe Shmuel, waiting for him at a suda. They brought before Shmuel fish that had been placed hot into a meat plate, and he ate it with kutach. Shmuel offered some to Rabbi Lazar, but he didn't eat it. Shmuel said to him, to your Rebbe Rab, from whom you learned that fish that was placed hot into a meat plate but not be eaten with kutach, I give such a dish, and he ate it, and you don't eat it. Why do you have to be more from than him? Shmuel intimated that Rab was chayzer from what he said. So Asla Kamei de Rab, so Rabbi Lazar, I guess, wanted to relay what happened to his Rebbe Rab, and he came before Rab. They said, did you retract from what you previously taught? Far be it from the child of Abba bar Abba, who was Shmuel. He was a very big chassid, right? That's what Rav says. Abba bar Abba, Avur the Shmuel Hava chassid Gadlaya. The father of Shmuel is called Abba bar Abba, and we have the story in the Gemara Brachas and that Chesam and Beis about it, and the story from the Bahag with the Kvitzas Hadarach about it as well, why he was called Abba bar Abba. And over here Rashi says he was a chassid gadol haya, and he's going to be very careful with what he eats. As we mentioned in the previous year, that there's a tremendous chasidus when a person is careful about what he eats, kahalacha, not chumras l'gabei chumras because of political reasons, but when a person's careful about what he eats because of Yerushalayim. So chassid zare the Abba bar Abba delisvile midi delisvile. He says, far be it from the child of Abba bar Abba to serve me something which I don't hold, something which I hold to be usher. In other words, the incident never happened. The obvious question is that if the incident never happened, Shmuel was lying to Rabbi Lazar. So the Ritva answers that when Shmuel said that it was served to Rav and he ate it, he means an exaggeration. If I had offered it to Rav, he would have certainly ate it. I would have proven to him that not barnat is going to be mutter. Okay, and there's a lot more talk on this Gemara specifically, and obviously a lot more to talk about not barnat as well. But we will not go through it now. Rav Huna, Rav Chibar, Ashi, Aviyasu, Rav Huna, Rav Chibar, Ashi were sitting, Chad B'Haigis of the Mabra, the Sur, Chad B'Haigis of the Mabra, one on this side of the Sur River crossing, and one on the other side of the river crossing. Lamar, Aishle, Dagam, Shalom, Bakar, B'Achal, B'Kutach. To one, they brought fish that had been placed onto a hot meat plate, and he ate it with Kutach. Lamar, Aishle, Te'en, Vanavim, B'Sei Chasuda. And to the other one, they brought figs and grapes during the meal of Achav Lebarach, and he ate them, and he didn't make a bracha. He ate them without bread, but during a meal that started with bread, and he did not make a bar pri eitz beforehand or an al ha'etz afterwards. Samar Amalei Lechavres, one Rebbe said to the other one, Yasma Avad Rabba Chachi, did your master do this? Did your Rebbe do this? He called him a Yasim. Why did he call him a Yasim? Because many times a person who's a Yasim didn't know what was supposed to mean, meaning he was the Yasim of a proper Rebbe. Yasma, Rashi says, Beloy das, a person has a certain amount of intellect and knowledge that comes from his parents. If a person doesn't have parents, he doesn't know. That's the famous line that the Mishabru is written for Yisayim and Mabalik Shuvah. Whether it was or wasn't, I don't know, but it definitely more than Yisayim and Mabalik Shuvah use it. But, the real literature, some people like to say that the real literature in Hagam is if you follow the Aruch HaShulchan. But I'll call Panim over here, the reason why he's calling him a Yasim is because he didn't know. I mean, he was calling him out that he didn't know. So let's say this again. So Lamar, to one, they brought fish that was hot onto a meat plate, and he ate it with kutach. Lamar, to the other one, they brought figs and grapes during the meal of Achav Lebarach, and he ate them and did not make a bracha. Mar Omale Lechavre Yasm Av Rabba Chachi. One Rebbe said to the other Rebbe, did your Rebbe not do this? Did your Rebbe do this? Mar Omale Lechavre. And the other one said to the other one, Yasm Avad Rabba Chachi, did your Rebbe do this? Each one berated the other one for having acted improperly. In this context, orphan means unlearned one who was orphaned of a proper Rebbe. The Gemara Brachas and Daf Mem Aleph and Rebbe's paskins that foods such as figs, grapes, and other fruits are generally eaten after the meal as desserts, and are only exempted from the bracha of Hamaitzi and Berkas Hamazon made over the bread when they are smeared on the bread and actually eaten together with it. If they're eaten separately, even during the meal, they require their own bracha rishona and bracha achrona. So the one who Mar Amle Lechavre, the one who ate the fish with kutach, said to the other one, "Anak Shmuel severely. I hold like Shmuel, who's matter to eat fish with kutach." Mar Amle Lechavre, the other one says, the one who ate the figs and grapes without a bracha, Anak Reb Chia severely. I hold like Reb Chia. The tiny Reb Chia taught in a brisa, passed by Taras Kolmin Emachal the bracha. The one recites on bread. Amaitzi lechem na'aretz patters the chiyuv bracha for all types of foods, even fruits that one eats during the Suda of Yain Pater Kolmin Emashkin. Similarly, the bracha one recites on wine, Bar Priyagofen, is patters the chiyuv for all other types of mashkis. Omar Chizki Mishum Abaya. So back to the story of the nice and tam. So Chizki is said in the name of Abaya, Helchas Adagam Sha'ol Bakar Mutal Oichel Mekutach. The halacha is that fish that was placed when it was hot into a meat plate may be eaten with kutach, but but a radish that was cut with a knife with which meat was cut may not be eaten with kutach. And this chumrah applies only to a radish. Kufyud Beis Amar Aleph. The agav churfei bala, because due to its sharpness it absorbs. Because of the radish's sharpness, it absorbs into itself the residue from the meat that's usually found on the knife surface, as we explained in the previous Amr. Aval kishus garu lebei piski va'achel. But squash that was cut with the meat knife, one can scrape off the surface area of the cut, and he may eat the rest of the vegetable with kutach, because squash is sweet and does not absorb. In contrast to radishes, which are sharp, squash is sweet and does not draw the meat residue onto the knife surface into itself. Hence, the knife's meat residue merely sticks to the surface area of the cut, and it's good enough to scrape off the surface area. Kilchi to lift the shari. One can cut turnip stalks with a meat knife, even with a standard meat knife, which is presumed to have meat residue on its surface, meaning even if it wasn't cleaned off. The silka, if one cuts stalks of beets with a meat knife, asiri, they are also with kutach. Because like radishes, beets are sharp and absorb the meat flavor. Bipasach bu the lifta, if he interchanged cutting the beets with stalks of turnip, shapir dami, you could eat the beets together with the kutach, and it's not an issue, meaning he cut a turnip, then a beet, and then another turnip, then another beet. Each beet is going to be mutter with kutach. It sounds like he's playing a good beet over here. The extremely sweet turnip flavor negates the meat flavor of the knife to the extent that even a beet cut after it will not get the flavor of meat into the food that will be discernible b'chlal. Boy minei Rav Dimi Rav Nachman. Rav Dimi asked the question of Rav Nachman, Ma'u lanuche kada de milcha gabe kada de kamcha. Kamcha is with a chaf, not with a kuf. What's the halacha with respect of placing a jug of salt next to a jug of kutach? Kamcha is a dairy dip, meaning both containers were uncovered. Do we need to be concerned that some of the kutach might spill while we don't notice into the salt, and then one might inadvertently use this salt, the salt of pot of meat, with the salt? Omalei, so Rav Nachman said to Rav Dimi, it's also to put the two together. Tosfos says that Rav Nachman asks only placing a jug of kutach next to salt, since people might not appreciate the need to prevent kutach from spilling into the salt. This doesn't mean that Rav Nachman would aser storing open milk next to open meat. In that case, people would be more careful to prevent one from touching each other. I always find it interesting when I go to the store and I buy something, that if I'm putting in the same wagon, I'm putting in hot dogs or cholent meat and a bottle of milk, to make sure that the milk is standing upright and not going to spill. Because even though it's packaged, but you could try to be careful. The chalamai, and with placing what's the din regarding placing a jug of vinegar next to the kutach? What's the halacha? Since it was common to add vinegar to a meat dish, so do we need to be concerned that some of the kutach might spill when we don't notice into the vinegar that's right next to it, and then one might add vinegar to the meat? Omalei shari. Rav Nachman said that this case is mutter. Umayshna, what's the difference between the two cases? Why do you aser it in the case of salt but not in the case of vinegar? Zok the Gemara, Zok Rav Nachman, chitechel lulav kur de milcha. When you will measure out a quart of salt, I'll explain to you the difference. Of course, a large measure of 30 sa, which is a light-hearted expression frequently used by Rav Nachman, and it means if you pay me by measuring salt for me, I'll explain the difference to you. Rav Nachman actually did not actually wait for him to perform this service and answer the question right away. And we have a lot of Torah on this in the Gemara Shabbos and the Dalet Amud Beis, where the Gemara also mentions this lashon. It's Dalet Amud Aleph. We also had it on Yud Beis Amud Aleph, but we always say over from the Hagah of the son of the Neziv and the Hakdama, that Gemara Kedushin on the Lamed says the Benay Zarz Umamulach Mimenu, but some have gears in the Gemara. Zarz Umamulach Mimenu, he's more salty, meaning he's sharper. And he brings from the Reifim that they say that the salt helps with the brain and helps learning, helps retain the information. And I think we could say Pashut based on what we know about salt and what we've been discussing previously here in the Gemara, that the concept of salt is that it brings out the tam of things. So you want a large amount of salt to bring out the tam in a lot of different things. So my time, what's the reason for the difference? What's the difference? The difference is in the case of salt, if the kutach were to spill onto the salt, you would be able to identify the substance of Isser. In the case of vinegar, if kutach were to spill into the vinegar, the substance of Isser would not be able to be identified. The reason why kutach is obviously not usher, it's a dip, but in a sense it would be forbidden to mix it with meat. Due to its thick texture, the kutach would not be absorbed by the salt and become bottled, rather it would remain distinct and discernible. Well, accordingly, if one will subsequently take some of the salt and place it into a meat, he'll be placing some unnullified kutach along with it, which is why it's forbidden in the case of salt. Mashenkin, in the case of vinegar, you wouldn't notice it, which is very interesting, but it's like, I guess, some kind of thick, buttery type of substance. Zakti Gemara Maisa. There was a shechted young pigeon that fell into a container of kutach. Rav Chinna, the son of Rava of Pashrunya, was matirit. Even though kutach is salty, and Shmuel said before in Kufyid Aleph Beis that salted things is as if it's hot. Rav Chinna permitted eating the pigeon meat after rinsing off the kutach that was on it, and he wasn't concerned that it absorbed the salty kutach. So Amar Rava said, "Man chakel l'mishrei ke'gavna." Who's wise enough to be matir something like this? Lav Rav Chinna bred Rav mi Pashrunya. If not Rav Chinna, the son of Rav of Pashrunya, because Rav Chinna holds that Kiyom Mashma Malech Harei Kreisach. That when Shmuel said previously in the Gemara that when something is salted, it's like it's hot. That applies only to where food was salted so strongly that it's inedible on the basis of its saltiness. But this kutach is edible on the basis of its saltiness. Now it's just interesting that obviously Rava and Rava Mipashrunya are two different people. Now chances are there were 4 or 5 Ravas running around in the times of the Gemara. Also very interesting, I don't remember who the author was, but one of these more academic Talmudists wrote a whole shtickle Teda, actually came across it more than once, that there was one Rava who was klar, who's either at the very, very end of the Ameiraim or the beginning of the Saveiraim, who's sort of like Mashlim of Sugyas, and it's not the Rava from Abaya in the Gemara, it was obviously a few divers later. Okay, so again, if it's too salty to eat, so then it's pashut that it's kirei seach. But if it's ein nechal machmas milchai, so then it's then we say the halacha malei harei kirei seach. But kutach is edible even when it's so salty, so we don't say it that it's not inedible, and we won't say that kutach malei harei kirei seach. Vani milei chai. This also applies only where the pigeon was ruah, meaning it wasn't cooked. Amal tzli, but if the pigeon had fallen into the kutach when it was roasted by a klifa, then you need to peel off the outer layer, all of the surface all around, so the kutach came in contact with the meat. For the kutach will have penetrated the roasted meat to the depth of a peel, meaning to peel off the outermost layer. Vi isbe pili kule aser, and if the roasted meat has cracks in it, it's forbidden entirely, and the peeling does not help. If the roasted meat had cracks in it, peeling doesn't suffice, for the kutach enters through the cracks and permeates the entire bird, which will make it aser. Metabel betavlin kule aser. Similarly, if it had been seasoned with spices, it's forbidden in ganzen, even if it has no cracks, as we explained before. And when spices are cooked with the meat, make it soft and especially absorbent, so that when the meat falls into the kutach is absorbed throughout the entire piece of meat. The Sefer Truma argues with Rashi and says that the Gemara's 2 chumras of cracks and spices apply even when the meat is run cold. However, most Rishonim follow Rashi that these 2 chumras apply only to roasted meat that were mentioned previously. So Kumtai said, according to those who explain roasted to mean hot, the entire piece of meat is asur only when it's hot and cracked or hot and spiced. But if the meat was cold, then rinsing is good enough, even if the meat was cracked or seasoned. According to those who explain roasted to mean previously roasted, however, the cracked or seasoned meat was the one roasted becomes asur in its entirety, even if it falls into kutach when it is cold. Okay, at this point, the Gemara goes back to the discussion about dam in the meat. Rav Nachman said, in the name of Shmuel, Kika shachatach ala basar. If a person has a loaf of bread on which one cut a piece of roasted meat on it, asur la'achla, person is asur to eat the bread. Now this is very reminiscent of 2 different Gemaras. There's a Gemara in the 7th parak on brachas which talks about the covet that a person has to have for bread, and it says that you shouldn't do this because it'll make the bread dirty. And also there's a Gemara brachas on daf chesam. Oh, both Gemaras are brachas. How do you like that? There's another Gemara on chesam beis and brachas that says that lesechtach al gabe hayad, you do not want to cut anything when you're holding it in your hand because you may cut yourself, and then the blood from your cut will go into the food. So kika shachatach ala basar asur la'ichloi. If a person has a loaf of bread on which one cuts a piece of roasted meat, one is asur to eat the bread. So the shaila is, what are we talking about? Now this meat, the Rashba speaks out that this meat was not salted to extract the blood, rather the person was relying on the roasting to extract the blood. Now, cutting the meat will cause the blood to come out of it, so the blood is absorbed by the bread, which will make it asur. And this is only a place where it was reddened. Meaning what? Where the meat had been bruised while the animal is still alive. So it's only then that we're concerned that the roasting will not remove all the blood, and the liquid coming out of the cut actually contains some blood. And this applies only where the liquid penetrated the loaf completely all the way to the other side. And this applies only to where the liquid is thick like blood. Okay, to Shiloh with the gear scissors how to touch the word, but al-kopanim, the asmechei means that it's thick. But if the liquid is thin, we have no concern about it. And a lot of times, you pick up a piece of meat and you have the diaper and the package over there and it's red and people get nervous, oh, it's blood. I don't know what it is, but it's not anything to be concerned about because klishta las lamba. Shmuel shadid leil kalba. Shmuel would throw the loaf over which the roasted meat was cut to his dog. Rav Huna yav leil shame. Rav Huna would give it to his attendant to eat, but he wouldn't eat it himself. Just interesting that Shmuel had a dog. Maybe it was part of his doctorisms. Some say lekalba, not necessarily to see his own dog, as it's mentioned in Duke Seifrim. The Shmuel acted l'shitasai, which he said before, that the meat liquid absorbed by the loaf might be blood, which may not be eaten, so he would have to get rid of it, and he would give it to the dogs, or his own dog if he had one. Manavshach. Practically more like this. However you wish to explain Rav Huna's shita, his conduct appears inexplicable, because he gave it to his attendant. Ishari l'kulei al mashari. If Rav Huna holds that it's mutter, and that's why he allowed his shamish to eat it, then it's mutter for everyone. Why then did he not eat it himself? He also l'kulei al ma'asar. And if he holds that it's asr, like Shmuel holds, then why didn't he eat it himself? Then why did he not eat it himself? Then it's asr for everyone. How then could he feed it to the shamish? Zakti Gemara, Shani Rav Huna, the Anina Daite. Rav Huna was different than others because he had a delicate disposition. Rav Huna, in fact, argues with Shmuel and maintains that the loaf is mutter me'ikar adin, and the reason why he didn't eat it was that he found it offensive due to his delicate nature. And as we were seeing throughout Masechta Chulin, and we'll probably see more in other areas in Shas also, about the different personalities, like we had Nefesh Yafa Techlai in the beginning of Yosef Esbenai. Rava Achalei, Rava would eat the loaf, even though it had juice that was red like blood, and even when it met all the conditions mentioned in the Gemara before, in all the, when we mentioned the Isser from Shmuel, and he would call the liquid that had oozed out of the meat the wine of the meat. This indicates that the juice that Rava ate was red like wine, so Rava holds that once the meat is roasted sufficiently, it is not possible for it to contain any more blood, and whatever floats afterwards, regardless of color or texture, is meat juice, and that's fine. The law is like Rava, that once the meat is roasted until it's half done, at which point most people will eat it, any juice that oozes out from it will be mutar. You may not place a bedugi vessel under roasting meat to catch the dripping fats until all red liquid has drained from it, as we saw before on Kufyat Aleph Amud Beis. Mina Yadinan, how do we know when the meat has reached this point? Meaning, how can we ascertain that the blood no longer drips from the meat? Masutra said in the name of Rav Papa, when a column of smoke rises. Very interesting, because we usually have this by Keteris, and here we took the bed in our kitchen. When smoke starts to rise from the meat, it indicates that the meat is no longer giving out any blood. Or the meaning could be that when smoke begins to rise from the coals beneath the meat. When blood drips on the coals, it will cause them to be extinguished. It's only when the undiluted fat drips on the coals that they give off smoke. And we know that from when we make a barbecue, that is what happens. Maskul Ravashi objected to this, and he said, perhaps only the bottom part of the meat has reached the point, which is why the smoke is rising, but the upper part of the meat has not reached this point, so that part wouldn't be ready. Meaning maybe the only lower part of the meat, which is closer to the fire, became sufficiently roasted to be drained of its blood, and that's why there's smoke. But the upper part of the meat has yet to become sufficiently roasted and still contains blood that will drip into the container on the bottom. So Ravashi therefore paskins differently. Meaning, obviously we have to ask a question over here that l'chayra, the other Amiram should be concerned about this issue. So why was Shmuel, let's say, not concerned about this issue? Ayin Rajba. Elam Ravashi says less like Takanta. There's no tikkun, there's no remedy for placing the bedugi under the roasting meat. Ela mishda beitarti galili milcha, but you have to throw in 2 lumps of salt, which will cause any blood that collects in the bottom to be drawn to the salt at the bottom of the kli. Kufyud bezimut bez. And then you gently pour off the fat that's at the top of the pan without stirring up the blood that may have collected at the bottom. Right? As we explained that you've been using this device of putting 2 lumps of salt in the beitugi before placing it under the roasting meat, then one is allowed to place it under the meat even at the beginning of the roasting. Although the smoke has yet to rise and the meat at that point certainly contains blood, any blood that drips into the beitugi will be drawn to the salt at the bottom of the kli, and the fat at the top can then be thrown out. Okay, Ravashi said to Ravashi, the Shmuel really say this, that once red liquid has drained from the meat, one may place a kli underneath it to catch the dripping fat. Shmuel said, If one has a loaf of bread on which one cut a piece of roasted meat, it's also to eat it because of the blood that it absorbs. So you see that Shmuel holds that roasted meat does contain residue of blood. How then is he matter placing the catcher under the meat without putting the salt? So Sakti Gemara, shiny Hossam, it's different here in the case of roasted meat that's cut agav dukka the sakina palut. Because due to the pressure that the knife is exerting on the meat will squeeze out blood that will not be drawn out by roasting. Shmuel holds that there still might be blood left in the meat after the smoke rises, but roasting no longer draws out the blood at that point. That's why the smoke rises and why it's permitted to place a peiduki at that point, since only fatty juice is dripping from the meat. But if one cuts the roasted meat with a knife, the pressure exerted by the knife forces blood that might remain in the meat out onto the bread beneath it. Okay, the Gemara brings another din from Reb Nachman about blood. Reb Nachman said, fish and birds that were salted with one another are asur, because the fish alone are asur because they absorb the blood that comes out from the birds. The same would apply to fish and animal meat as well. The blood of kosher fish, unlike the blood of birds and other animals, is not asur. So the fish in this case are not being salted for any halachic reason, but just the way we're preparing the fish, you want the salty fish. The birds, however, were raw and were being salted in order to kasher it by removing its blood. And in this case, most people learn that the birds, however, are mutter. The salting of birds draws out its blood and juices, and this falls on the fish. This forbidden blood, which is hot, like Shmuel said before, that maliach hareu kareiseach, and penetrates into the fish, making it aser. The chicken meat, however, does not reabsorb any of the blood that came out and remains mutter. Hey Chidami, what kind of case are we talking about in regard to salting it? If we're talking about a kli that has no holes in it, so then the blood won't be able to run out. If it's not asiri, then even when you have two chickens that are salted with one another, it would also be aser. As the Gemara is going to say later in Kufyud Gimel Amud Beis, that meat must be salted in a kli that has holes in it, so that the blood will have a place to drain. If, however, it's salted in a kli that doesn't have holes, so the blood that's going to come out of the meat is going to remain in the kli and become reabsorbed by the meat, making the meat aser, which is why you have to be careful when you're salting. This is what you have to be looking out for when you're salting meat. Now, I don't know too many people that salt their own meat today, but it's definitely something fun to do. So, and if you're using a kli that has holes in it, I feel it's not mishari. Then even fish and birds that were salted with one another should also be mutter. Meaning, because just as like it's mutter to salt two pieces of meat one on top of the other in a kli that has holes in it, because the blood that's coming from the upper piece will drain through the holes and it's not going to be absorbed by the lower piece. So if in the case of fish and birds, the blood oozing from the birds drains through the holes and it's not going to be absorbed by the fish. So Zakti Gemara no. Actually, Rav Nachman is talking about a case where the fish and birds were salted in a kli that has holes in it. And why then are the fish aser? Because the fish mishum derafu karmayu, since their skin is soft and has holes in it, kadmi upalti, they spit out the blood and juices much quicker. But kmiti, while the meat of birds is tight, which slows the blood and juices from coming out. So after the fish finish spitting out the juices, the birds will still spit out its blood, and then the fish could absorb the blood from it, which is why the fish are going to be aser. Okay. I think Gemara brings a mice about this. It happened that the meat of a properly shechted animal was salted for Rav Mari bar Rachel. Again, we mentioned yesterday Rav Shimon Pazi, that Pazi was his mother. So Rav Mari bar Rachel is definitely a woman's name. So why was he called Rav Mari bar Rachel? I believe Rashi in a few places tells us what the story was. And Mitzvah Shem, when we get there, we will see that. Again, we have the story with Rav Mori Bar Rochel. So there was a properly shechted animal that was salted together with the meat of a treifa in a kli that had holes in it. He came to Rava to ask about the status of the kosher meat. The kosher meat certainly does not absorb the blood of the treifa meat, just as the kosher meat does not absorb the blood of another kosher meat that it was salted together with. The question is whether the kosher meat absorbs the juice of the treifa meat. So do we say that any other liquids that come out of the treifas can be a problem? And does it repel other juices just as it repels other blood? Or do we say that a piece repels only blood, which is slippery, but not juice, which is not slippery, and it would be more absorbed? So Rava answered him by citing the following B'raisa. Hatameim, the Torah says in regard to shratzim, these are the contaminated ones. Shratzim are creeping creatures, and all creeping creatures are forbidden to be eaten. But 8 of these creatures have additional tumah in the sense that their nevelas are metame. The B'raisa focuses on the hay of the hatameim, of the contaminated ones. So what's hatameim? What's the point of saying hatameim? Lesser tziram b'reitvan b'kibush elahem. The extra hay at the beginning of the word comes to aser their juice, their gravy, and their sediment. The tzir is the juice that oozes from the meat through salting. The reitiv is the gravy which comes out of the meat through the fire, such as through cooking. And the kippah are the small shreds of meat that fall from the sherets during cooking, and the spices that gel at the bottom of the pot. So just as the juice of a sheret is aser, so too the juice of a treifa should be aser, and that juice of the treifa is absorbed into the kosher meat that was salted with it, making the kosher meat aser because the meat juice is more easily absorbed than blood. As the Gemara says elsewhere, the pasuk regarding sherets is not the source of the same halacha with regard to a treifa, which there is a different makar. Rabbi here, however, simply brings this B'raisa as a shorthand for the general halacha, which indeed applies to both sherets and non-kosher meat. Okay, let's stop here, and we will continue on Daf Kuf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph.